This is without doubt the biggest rivalry in chess right now, so it's world champion Magnus Carlsen against the up-and-coming superstar Alireza Firouzja. We're rewinding to Norway Chess 2020, their classical game was drawn, so they went to this Armageddon. Magnus has white, he has to win, Alireza only needs a draw. So he kicks off with pawn to d4 here. Alireza goes knight f6, and after c4, e6, we head down a Queen's Gambit declined line. That's what Alireza was playing this tournament. And now after takes here, we have this so-called Carlsbad structure on the board. The bishop came to g5, pawn c6, pawn e3, h6 now from Alireza, and this is a trendy sideline. More commonly, back in the day, you'd see things like bishop to e7. So the bishop drops back here. Now we have bishop e7, and the queen came to c2. In their classical game, Magnus went bishop to d3 there, and he brought this knight to e2. But here he goes for, after castles, knight to f3 instead. So the rook came to e8 here, bishop d3 played, and now the main move here is knight b to d7, but Alireza plonks this knight on e4, immediately hitting the outpost. The bishops came off the board here, and now the most normal way for white to play would be with simply castles. But what Magnus does is takes on e4. He needs to shake it up here. So the pawn recaptured. He drops the knight into d2, hitting that pawn for a third time. You could go bishop f5 to defend it, but Alireza sees no reason not to go pawn f5. He holds that pawn and Magnus castles queenside. So this is his big idea. He wants to attack the king, make it an interesting game. So Alireza goes knight to d7, and now Magnus lashes out. He goes pawn g4 here. Now Alireza responds in a very principled manner. He takes that pawn. Although now it looks like white is dominating the centre here, actually white has some long-term problems. So this pawn is now a backwards pawn and can be targeted later, and also the black minor pieces are coming really nicely into the game now. So knight b6 from Alireza, he's looking at c4 and d5 here. He could have started with his pawn b5 stuff, but he wants to play positionally. Knight g3 now from Magnus, he covers the f5 square, the bishop was potentially coming there otherwise. Bishop to e6 now, king b1, and now rook f8 starts targeting this backwards pawn. Magnus is under pressure, so he needs to carry on mixing up, try and generate an initiative. He goes pawn to e4 here, but this is a weakening move because now this pawn is weak as well as this pawn, and Alireza wants to target them. So he starts with rook a to d8 here, and now if Magnus goes something like rook to d2, holding both pawns like this, well then you're running into knight c4, you'd have to come to d3 or d1, a nice initiative for black. So instead Magnus brings this rook to the e-file, but now a very simple tactic, queen to f6, hits both pawns. Magnus is really in trouble here. So he lashes out, he goes pawn to f4, trying to shake it up. Alireza can simply take that one en passant, but Magnus blockades. He sticks the queen on f2, and both players are getting really low on time now. It's getting tense. So after queen f2, the knight hopped into c4, and now different ways for Magnus to play. He could start with b3 or pawn e5, but he goes rook g1. He's setting up this tricky idea of knight h5, hitting queen, hitting g-pawn. So Alireza goes queen h4, gets away from the threat, also looks at e4. b3 kicked the knight, it hopped back into d6 here, and now king b2, Magnus takes some prophylaxis, improves his king, protects his knight. And now best here for black was actually pawn to b5. This is a really uncomfortable threat to meet, of just going b4, kicking this knight, then e4 will be a bit more loose. If you go e5 yourself as black, white rather, then black can go b4, say knight a4, knight b5. Black's just got all of these wonderful outpost squares, so much pressure against this backwards pawn, really tricky. But Alireza was playing more positionally here. He just went rook to f7, trying to protect his king, batten down the hatches, and then go after Magnus at a later point. So rook to d2 from Magnus. This rook came to the f-file, rook e1 now, the king stepped away to h8, and now Magnus goes rook d3. At some point he'd love to pick up this thorn pawn in his position, try and then get some counterplay through the centre here. So rook f4 played, invading on that rank, again pressuring these pawns. So Magnus goes pawn e5, but he now gives up these beautiful light squares. All of the minor pieces will be flooding in just a moment. So knight f5 played. And now you can't take this one or you lose your queen on f2. So this knight came across, supported the other one, centralized, but now the bishop finds this lovely home on the d5 square, cutting down the board here. Magnus has to take action. This is his only opportunity to pick up this pawn, so that's what he does. And now, can you find the best move for black here? And if you're enjoying this video, do hit that like button, let me know. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, consider subscribing to never miss a future video. So here black could have played rook takes on f3. Then the queen would recapture, and then here's the trick. You take on h2 with check, winning a pawn, and after rook to e2 blocking, you can actually take on g3. This is the tactic that I imagine Firouzja missed in the time trouble. Now the point is that if you recapture with the knight, we take here with the bishop, white is actually a piece down. And if instead you take with the queen here, or if you throw in this tricky queen takes on f5, when the smoke clears, black will be a pawn up, doing really well. But Alireza missed this one. He didn't take on f3 with the rook. Instead, he took on g3 with the knight. Magnus took back with pawn. He's forking these two pieces, but now Alireza can chop here. The queen recaptured, and after the rook takes, he picks up the queen here. Now the material is level, but black still has some pressure. Now you can't let this knight hit this wonderful outpost, so the bishop chopped it off, the rook recaptured, and now the king came to g8, coming back into the middle. And it's tough for white here, because this king's coming very fast to e6, and this one has to go the long way around to get into the game because this rook is cutting it. So king a3 played, both players desperately low on time already at this point. King to f7, king b4, and now I really like how Alireza plays here. Instead of going, say, pawn to g5, having a liquidation like this, it's very difficult to actually create winning chances. He plays pawn to h5 in this position. And what he wants to do is go rook g3 to g4, using that pawn to then either create a passed pawn here or win the h4 pawn. So Magnus goes a4. He needs queenside counterplay. King e6, pawn a5, rook g3, prepares this lift, and now Magnus had to go king c4 in this position. Then if rook g4, you can actually take that one here, because the king gets back just in time if we play this one through, and critically if black goes c5, breaking up these pawns, you can actually take. After these ones are captured, this is actually a drawn endgame, should be with best play. But after this move of rook to g3, Magnus flicks in this pawn a6, and after b6, then he goes king c4. But the difference here is that after rook g4, you can't now take that one, or after pawn captures, yes, you can march your king back just like we saw in the other variation, but then pawn c5 comes. And this time after captures, the pawn can recapture, king takes, this is a winning pawn endgame with that pawn on c5. This is the big difference. But Magnus realised this, his instincts are superb. So after rook to g4, he didn't take that one, he went king d3, holding the rook. And now pawn c5 would have been a winning move in this position, because say you capture this one, well, you've broken up the pawns now, and it's hard for white to actually defend this one. Now if you take here, pawn recaptures, this is a lost endgame. If you try and maintain your rook on e4 with king to e3 here, then king f5 is winning. That rook has to give ground, then the pawn is dropping, or this one will be a passer. It's all no good. And if you retreat the rook like this, well, then we can pick up on h4, and you've got two connected passers here. So it's just one for black. That would have been the way to go. But Alireza missed to go pawn c5. Instead, he checked. The rook blocked on e3. The rook bounced back to g4. Now rook f3 from Magnus, and c5 now from Alireza. Breaks up the pawns. Magnus captured, and now he went rook f8 going active. An excellent move. And Alireza's got a decision to make. He's got barely seconds. Does he take here? Does he take here? Well, Magnus is coming round, looking at this a7 pawn. Alireza takes on e5. Rook f7 now played. Hits this pawn. How do you respond? Alireza picked up the rook, went to play rook e5, came back, went to play it again, but he didn't complete the move. The rook goes flying, he loses on time, unfortunately. A fantastic game and the greatest rivalry in the future of chess, in my opinion. If you enjoyed this video, then click here to see my whole Magnus Alireza playlist. Thanks for watching, see you soon.